Add up pretty quick, I think. But I'm delighted to be here. It was really an honor to be invited, so I appreciate that, Brendan, and really it was neat to think about where we can put this research that, frankly, when you tell your parents you study gaming and nostalgia, you get some looks. And, I mean, I don't owe them any money, so then they don't care that much, but there is a little bit of like the black sheep of the family. Yeah, you're a doctor, but really, come on. Games. But I'm going to try to make a case that this isn't just marketing school. And I kind of went back and forth on going theoretical versus going data, and I kind of split the middle in a bit of a milquetoast way, knowing we'd have time to ask questions. Some of those questions might turn into research projects, and I want to encourage that. I think sometimes when speakers come, it's, look how smart I am leaving now. And I hope you remembered, I'm really good, right? And I'm not quite there in my career yet. I'm really more at that. There are some neat things we should be studying, and maybe you can consider this one along the way. I also am always actively looking for collaborations, and I say that meaning like, hey, I like to travel, so. But more importantly than that, I have learned in my career that some of the best work we've done has come from those collision spaces at conferences or at talks like this. You know, you carry around 100 stacks of cards, you give away 99 of them, you never see them again. And that one person that responds back, it turns into something like this. You know, so I just want to kind of keep that theme going throughout. Also a journal editor, so I'm going to talk to you about those kind of things as well, the good, the bad, and the net side. But my talk today is on nostalgia. It's on a topic that I always tell my students not to do research because sometimes it doesn't generalize outside your experience. Well, you're going to learn real quickly. This is a lot of research. Based on 41, I grew up with video games, and I had the pleasure, I think, of growing up when games emerged in the 80s. And, you know, I got to keep one foot outdoors and one foot indoors and do a little bit of both. And a lot of this was trying to discover my own fascination with buying the past. Is it just some cheap marketing ploy? I'm sure that's a lot of it, but I'm starting to see some of the psychology backing this up. There's a lot more going on in that experience. Okay, so let's get started. Ideally, you've seen the abstract of the call, so I'll leave that alone, but I want to start off by making sure we're on the same page with what a game is. Not just what a game is technically, but what it is sort of a social construction, right? So we go back to the earliest games. Space War is often considered the first video game, developed at MIT, 1961. And the reason it's considered the first video game is it relied on computer processing. There was a logic into the system. There were other, the technology-assisted games before this. But the thing about Space War is that it wasn't developed to be a game. So they wouldn't have been called computer scientists yet, but essentially computer scientists received this PDP-1 mainframe, and it's a literal computer. Here's the data, give me the results. Here's the data, give me the results. And the short version of the story is they kind of wanted to play with it. How much can this thing actually do? Are we really testing the limits of this machine? So what if we developed a demonstration program that did three things? It showed off as much of that computer's resource as possible. And it taxed it to the absolute limit. You know, it pushed this thing to the limit. In an area of work that I won't talk about much today, I look at cognitive demands. And I think of the same way. Games also tax you to the limit. Within a consistent framework, it should be novel. Every time you run it, it's not the same program. It's not just giving you the data back in the same exact way. It's relying on your input to give you output. So if you play Mario and you play Mario, even though it's a real similar board, that 1-1 first level, it's not exactly the exact same experience. You might choose to grab the mushroom and you choose to avoid the mushroom and stay small. And already you're seeing that that very small decision has led to a differentiating path of experience. And it should be fun. And it's not even clear why fun was a requirement, to be honest. But they made the first game, Space War. Is there a play? The needle versus the wedge. And you You're locked in mortal combat around this star well, and it's mostly computer controlled. There was no computer controlled player. We didn't know how to do that yet. That's computing power. So it's 2 people, right? There's lots of emulators online you can play Space War. And it was just, you don't hit the star, shoot each other. And the first ship to take out the other ship wins. This was a gimmick. This was never thought, we didn't go, okay, that's going to be $1 billion industry. You would find this game at other universities that had PDP-1 mainframes because it was, hey, cool, look what we developed for the mainframe. And they go, okay, neat. And then slowly people started having competitions around it, and the kind of word got out that, you know, this group of people and this group of people. I think at one point you could win like a Rolling Stone magazine subscription if you won the Space War competition. You had the earliest esports based around one of the very first video games. But this was not accessible to the public. This was universities, probably higher educated, probably white male, playing this game in the dungeons of the mainframe, and it kind of stayed there. And if you ask people what games are today, like what do you think the average age of a gamer is? Get a guess.
39.
Okay, you've done your homework. Stop being right. Hey, as a professor, and the students are like, oh, here's the exact right answer. Okay. Cool. That's not so far off, actually. Well, how do you arrive at that?
It's a leading question that the intuitive answer is like 21, but you'd assume that
you can see what's
rising up.
Yeah.
It's the same way that it's like what percentage of gamers are male and female, and it's a lot of people would say like 10, but it's actually like
50-50.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
You just sold the album, by the way. Here, you have it. I'm out. That's how good I am teach, by the way. You're spot on. I mean, and this is, of course, and apologies in advance. This is going to be the most ethnocentric presentation you've seen in quite a long time, because I do live in New York, so you know it's going to be U.S. examples. According to the Entertainment Software Association, keeping in mind that's an industry association, so there could be an inclination to present a better picture about games. Average gamer is about 33. Okay, not too far off. 76% of gamers are over the age of 18. I think that one does tend to surprise people, that if you slice up the pie, the majority of gamers are over 18. You do see about 52% self-report as male. So that's a pretty small number. Now, if you look a little deeper at that number by genre, it's not always that clear. So Nick Yee's research on gamer preferences does find some genre correlations, gender correlations to genre. About 70% play weekly. And the report describes what weekly means. It's not just I turned it on and I played, but generally speaking, you could argue there's some frequency of play there. About 77% of this is intergenerational play. It's those 33-year-olds have children and they're playing with their children. And I'm going to talk about that later because it's one of the findings. This is the first area of research where when I've collected data, I've gotten emotional over the data. I did this crazy thing with qualitative data where you just ask people something and they just tell you how they feel. You know, I both do surveys, and then over time I've learned that it doesn't answer the entire question, that you sometimes have to extract more information and talk to your participants. And I have had these experiences, and I'll share some of them later. So a lot of my research nowadays is very mixed method. It's a bit of a, from my university, Michigan State, they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll let you in the club, but keep your coat outside, you know. I'm being a bit playful, but I'm sure these debates happen probably in Ireland as well. You know, maybe even in this room, maybe there's some daggers right now.
Our head of school is very cool, so we're a big mixed methods.
Okay, this works. But I'll be in Antwerp in May giving a workshop on how to do legitimately mixed method research. It's become a passion of mine. This is going to be important because this doesn't match that, right? What I mean is that's not who this was for, but it's grown since then. These numbers are going to be incredibly relevant when we think about what nostalgia is going to end up meaning here in a little bit, okay? How do you define nostalgia? Well, that's tricky. We're all different ages. Nostalgia is inherently not subjective per se. I mean, it is a subjective experience of memory work, and we'll talk about personal historical nostalgia, but it's always referent to who you are. So if the average gamer is 33 in the United States, for them, nostalgia is somewhere around the Super Nintendo. That would be the oldest possible system. And if you think about when you were developing able to actually play games, probably more like Sony PlayStation or maybe even like GameCube. My students, I don't know where they go on that. They're somewhere listening to crazy new music and I don't understand it. And, we have that gap, okay? I'm 41, just before the Nintendo. So to me, an Atari is still that wasn't mine. We had one, but it wasn't mine. The Nintendo was mine, although I was a Sega kid. Sega was a lot cheaper than the Master System. We were a Sega family, let's just put it that way. We were not a fancy Nintendo family. This plays an important role because when I talk about nostalgia, when we think about nostalgia, we tend to make some presumptions. 8-bit graphics to these kids are somewhere in the Stone Age. Right? But that's also going to play an important role later. Okay. So when we're defining nostalgia, there's actually a lot of sort of debate and discussion about what is retro. So retro can be defined as flavors of the past. But when you're working with temporal constructs, you always have to anchor that within the context of your participants. So if you're going to do nostalgia work, you have to be careful. I don't feel 41. My body feels 41. I don't feel 41. But I started to realize my experiences are 41. They're frayed wires. And when they made wireless controllers, I learned the hard way. I threw my controller and it's not tethered anymore. So that thing went, 20 feet plus down the hallway. When we think about a medium of any kind maturing, there becomes an interest in its original content. So I'm a film guy. All of my friends make fun of me because I teach courses on pop culture and inclusion, and I watch 50s Westerns. And if you've ever seen a US 1950s Western, it's not very, well, it's inclusive, it's diverse, but it's not diverse in the way where you'd be like, hey, look, John Wayne, look what he's, oh my God. So what we do is we develop an interest in that old content. So one way we do it is we just recreate the old content. For me, Mario Kart had 8 carts. That's it. It was somewhere in the early 90s, right here. And when that game came out, it was revolutionary. It was this cute little racing game where you lost friendships over it, right? And there were only 8 carts. There's 4 types. 1 female, by the way, Princess. And Princess Peach and the dinosaur have the same skill set. So there's your representation. And of course, that game was reinvigorated, redeveloped, reinvigorated, redeveloped, reinvigorated, redeveloped. And I do have the brand new, and actually that's not even the newest one because there's the Mario Kart for the Switch that has the expansion pack that they add things to it all the time, right? Including shout outs to the original content, right? So one way of engaging nostalgia is going through a deep textual history of a content and recycling it. And there are some cynical views on this, like we're not creative anymore. I would push back on the hunch to go there because I'll tell you, it's really tough to make old content fresh. There is a creativity in retelling that story. And I also have a bias to where I tend to lean a little more positive towards nostalgia. But I can give you a reading that breaks down the positive and negative takes on it if you're interested. So one is reviving the familiar by breathing life back into it again, bringing it back to us again. And frankly, reselling our past to us. Hey, sucker who's 41 who probably has disposable income. Remember when you paid $50 in 1994? You want to do it again? 8 times. I did it every single time. Have them all. There is reviving the familiar by bringing it back in its kind of original form. So anybody have a Nintendo Switch? Do you subscribe to the online package? Yeah, I love the online package. You can play the original Super Mario. It's not even Super Mario, it's just regular Mario. So you had this like flat screen TV and wireless in your house and broadband and this portable computer video game, and you're playing that. And they haven't even remastered the sound. Just beep, beep, boing, beep. And I don't know, I can play it for hours. I don't know, you might get, maybe it's still fun. I think it's fantastic. My partner and my family make fun of me all the time because I have all this equipment and I'm down there playing Sonic the Hedgehog, on the main TV. But there's also, reviving the familiar. And our gut is going to be, it was for me. We're going to find out later that wasn't necessarily the case. And then, of course, a third way to revive the familiar is to actually bring it back. So some of you might know about the mini system craze from about 4 years ago, where the gaming companies were re-upping their patents on their original designs. And it was a little weird, like Nintendo was going back and I actually had the patent number on my papers. They went back and repatented their controller, re-upped the trademark so they couldn't be used again. And people couldn't figure out why. It's because they sold it again. Has anybody played an NES Classic? It's uncanny. It is the same controller. It is the same buttons. It's the same screws in the back. I restore old games as a hobby, and quite literally, you could take the tools from 1983 and take apart the new controller and put the other parts in it, and they work just fine. It's incredible. They didn't touch a thing. We're going to talk later about the haptic qualities of nostalgia. There was a reason they stuck to that. And of course, the system is smaller because it was a little cuter. That's actually the shelf in my office. So that's the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo and the little Genesis and the little PlayStation and the little TurboGrafx, all running to an HDMI port that runs into my monitor. And a kid came in office hours yesterday while I was playing Contra. He didn't know what it was. I felt ashamed. I was more upset that he didn't know what the game was than I got caught, right? The NES Classic in June 2018 was the highest selling platform. It outsold the PS4 and the Xbox and the Switch that month. I think it was in the US, it was $99 US. They were hard to find if anybody was trying to find these things. They kind of ran out real quick, and about a year and a half later, they re-released them. The general suggestion is that I don't think Nintendo actually thought it would sell all that well, and so they just kind of cut some, put them out in the market, and they just disappeared. And then now I think you can buy them still if you go to the store, they're on offer and things like that. So again, it's, that's a pretty big commitment to nostalgia though. I'm going to literally, if I gave you a VHS copy of Aladdin right now, you'd be like, oh, thank you. What do I do with this? Right? And of course the game is a little different. So we haven't really defined nostalgia. We've just kind of walked through how games have grown from kind of this hobby to this somewhat ubiquitous experience to having a wine-like history where it's actually aged a little bit. All those things are going to be important for the study of nostalgia, right? So nostalgia we can define as this predominantly positive, social, past-oriented emotion. It is always looking backwards, okay? And it's always looking from the present to the past. Some use the word bittersweet. Some use the word wallowing, kind of staying in the past. What's on screen here is my hometown of St. Louis. That was the mall when I was a kid. I mean, it was the cover piece of this architectural magazine. It's a parking garage today. They kept the dome. That was nice. It was, my understanding, it was just too expensive to take down. They're like, hey, it's fine. It's the dome, whatever. It doesn't get rained in the cars. That's the important thing. And of course, I don't think about this. Or when I do, I maybe get sad. Like I remember as a kid going and eating a chicken sandwich at the mall. And it was the mall in the city. And like that city was cool. And a lot of memories attached to like St. Louis being right there. Even right now, I see it and I think about like what it was like to drive to the big city and not actually go shopping. You learn as a kid, shopping doesn't mean buying things for you. It just means walking around the space in which people buy things. The other times we're home empty-handed was pretty incredible now that I think about it, but it was still a positive memory. Sometimes this is critical, right? Because we often use nostalgia as a way to rationalize bad behavior or rationalize different politics at the time, Make America Great Again, which has a lot of implications. But I didn't know when that ranking came out that, those things happen as well. And I don't want to dodge those issues because we'll see them in gaming a little bit. Nostalgia is a remarkably sensory experience. I bet you can think about senses you've attached to nostalgia. One for me, my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, has a very special pizza that is thin, like a matzo cracker thin. It uses a cheese that you can only buy in St. Louis, but it's made in Wisconsin. They don't eat it, they just make it for us. And it's some unholy combination. Has anybody heard of an American Craft single? It's not actually cheese, it's 49% dairy. Easy singles, there you go. It's that mixed with like a provolone. So it's a white version of that. And the reason they made it is that when you cut it, it doesn't string. Because on a thin piece of pizza, if you had stringing everywhere, it'd fall off the pizza. What it does is stick to your mouth instead. And so all St. Louisans know the joy of burning your mouth on this deliciously artificial cheese pizza. But it's a memory of mine. I'm actually going home next week for a conference, and I'm taking a friend of mine from school, and we're going to go emos. And we're going to go do those things. Does anybody, can you think of one, just like a different sense that you have just a decidedly nostalgic attachment to? A sound, a smell?
Particular music that brings me to a moment in time.
Oh yeah, music is a big one. There's even some theorizing around adolescence and music that music tends to mark generations because we mark important milestones in our teenage years with song, and so those songs kind of stamp in like this entire vibe of a generation, right? Any other ones? What about touches or smells or sights?
You mentioned the game controller that I used to try and explain to my undergrad students about muscle memory, and if they turned their phone backwards, they could type their name, but you'd press the 3 key three times or whatever, and that now they wouldn't know that, but at the time when I was doing it, so I guess that's like a muscle memory, nostalgia for the feel of an old Nokia phone. Or
I think about when I have to explain to somebody what the buttons do, and I can't do it. I'm like, I'm like doing it really well, so I clearly know what I'm doing, and they're like, "Why aren't you telling me?" I'm like, it's a skill. Get good. That's my answer for you. That's my answer for you. Or explaining how mine was the feel of a manual transmission on a 1993 Ford Escort, because I burnt the clutch twice. Once learning how to drive, once trying to smoke the tires in the parking lot. In a 1993 Ford Escort, so 81 horsepower. They will smoke, and so will your transmission, and then eventually the car doesn't work. By the way, the smell of that, I had this nostalgic moment of the smell of a rotten clutch, because I was horrified about what my dad was going to think. Dad's response was, "You're going to learn how to fix a clutch." But I was telling Brandon earlier, I work on cars now, and I can tell you what a clutch smells like. When I'm like, oh, clutch is going bad, because when I was 14, I burnt this clutch, and that's there. But you can notice, like, we know that sensory experiences get affixed to past experiences, and they can kick up nostalgia really, really, really fast. Okay. Nostalgia, I mentioned it earlier, and I used to push back on this idea that it was social, because it seems by phenomenology to be individual. But nostalgia holds with it sort of a broader social definition. For one, when people recall nostalgic, those bittersweet memories, they almost always involve other people. And we see this in lab studies, we see this in interviews, we see this in anecdote. It's you and your friends, you and your parents, or it's references to the generation. I remember listening to Nirvana. You mentioned music. I don't like lights in my office, and I listen to 90s alt. And I think my students are terrified. It's so depressing in my office. It's just Nirvana, and then Rage, and then somebody else who was also angry at the time. And that's all it is. And then I went through a Motown kick for about a month, and they were really confused by it. It was very upbeat and happy in my office for a month. Nostalgia correlates with social outcomes. People who are feeling nostalgia will sometimes report feeling short-term social support, short-term connectedness. It almost serves as a psychological wellspring for like very short-term based reconnection, remembering yourself in relation to others, if that makes any sense. In part because you're often recalling a part of you that you were rather happy with. We think that nostalgia might play a role. I hate to say self-medication, that seems awfully strong, but it does seem to have this like very short-term psychological subjective well-being benefit in terms of connectedness in particular. We've seen nostalgia, it has an ability to compensate for social avoidance, whether it's suddenly someone mentions a song you like or a movie from your childhood, and there's like this reconnection, or maybe it's something more along the lines of, since you feel more connected sort of in the generic, you don't feel as much apprehension right away. And we have a recent manuscript that provides some of the citations if you were interested. But it surprised me because it seems like such an individualized experience. And yet time and time again in the data, qual, quant, anecdotal, it always involved this like other entity beyond the self. right? This is really important, not the baseball part. I know you don't care about that part, and I accept that. It's a very boring game, unless it's me, and then I love it. You don't have 6 hours to watch pajamas, and so there's two kinds of nostalgia. I mean, lots of folks define lots of different kinds of nostalgia. The ones that I think are relevant for this conversation are the personal nostalgia, which is the personal and self-relevant memory work, your past, your history. So I went to the game where they won that badge. I spent a lot of money on that. It seemed like a silly idea, and it was not a silly idea. It's still a cherished family. My dad, my brother, my mom, and I sat in like row ZZ, section ZZZZZ, subsection Z. Like, I'm not kidding. There was a chain link fence behind us, and watched our hometown baseball team win the World Series. And that was still like, we go home and talk about it. Like, oh, remember that time that we won the World Series? And like, well, we didn't win it, but it was nice to see the guys win it and running around. We joke around as 4 photos with my dad smiling, and 3 of them were from that game. One was probably like when my brother was born. Like, all right, that's it. That's 4. That's all you get, right? But they're your memories. And then there's historical nostalgia, ideations beyond experience, past eras. I think it's great the St. Louis Cardinals won the 1926 World Series. I take pride in that. I don't know why. My father's Taiwanese. My mom didn't come to the United States till the 40s. We didn't move to St. Louis until 81. But yet, to me, I'm like, oh, we've won 11 World Series. It was starting in 1926. I could rattle off the roster, the color of the jerseys, why I think that bird, all very docile looking, will mess you up in a baseball field. And I take pride in this. I even like think about the designs and like get excited about the organ music in the stadium when they bring it, they bring in the Clydesdales, because Anheuser-Busch owned the team. And if you let me go any longer, I won't stop on this point. But it's not my history. I own it, and I want to own it. I don't know if the movie hit overseas, but the movie 42, by chance, it's Jackie Robinson's story. If you watch it, it takes place during the 50s, early 60s. What's neat about it, I forgot the actor's name. If you saw the actor, you would know him. They trained him on 1950s era radio voice. And it's amazing watching him on screen speaking as if he was a 1950s era announcer. Different words, different inflection points. Now, I bet you can probably find a similar experience in Ireland if you were to go back and listen to eras of radio, different slang, different sayings. And I was so fascinated by, of all the parts of the movie, that one. It added a realism, but how do I know it's real? I wasn't even a thought yet. Like, I wouldn't, what the hell am I in 1950? We're so far pre-you, right? To the extent nostalgia is a ego-driven experience, right? But these two experiences are important because this one, spoiler alert, is probably driving the gaming boom. It's folks who want to engage the old stuff, and I get to be the curator of the old stuff, and that's what's kind of fun right now, right? So games and nostalgia. Gaming is unique because I can go back to that mall if I want to park my car, right? That's when I can go back to that mall. And many of us could go back home, but have you had that experience yet? It's not quite the same. And more times than not, it's a bit of a letdown. You're like, again, going home next week, I'm bringing my buddy Dave with me. Dave and I went to school together. I'm all excited to show him St. Louis, and I'm already preparing to know, like, that thing's going to be closed. That burger joint's not going to be there anymore. That highway's gone. I'm going to get lost and be embarrassed because he's like, oh, I thought you were from here. It's going to happen, and I'm just waiting for it. But to some extent with games, that world was unchanged. I think I'm at the stage now that I can hop in here blindfolded and I feel right at home. Not to be ableist with the vision, but in terms of like, I can negotiate this space. I can immediately and even quite frankly, looking at it right now, the music is already playing in the back of my head. And I'm already thinking about that damn part of the forest where if you just go down, it's a maze and you get stuck. So you have to actually go this way and then that way, and then it makes a noise, and then you can go through the forest and get to the next cave. That's true, by the way. You may play this game before. The forest will get you if you're not careful. And what most of us did, right? We threw the map away as soon as we opened the box. Like, I don't need this anymore. And then it turns out you actually need the map to this game, or you memorized it, frankly, right? We can go back there again. It's almost like it was saved for us to go back to. And in some cases, in a game like this, you actually have your save file from 30 years ago. Although a warning, if that's you, those batteries are dying. So most of these games have watch battery backup. Those batteries are dying now. And so there's a whole Reddit thread of folks that are 33 and above that are like, oh my God, my game's gone. I played Landstalker, I saved it, 99% completion. I wouldn't played it last week and it's dead. Yeah, so, and we don't actually know how to save it because even if you take it out for any length of time, once that charge dies, it's out. So there are some incredibly elaborate ways to keep the energy running. It's just not worth it. You end up like soldering this and crystallizing that and infinity gauntlet and this other thing. It doesn't work. But I'm not going to give up on it. Right? So we can go back to the past, maybe in a way that is different than other types of physical experiences. Right? You know, this, I took this picture from Google Maps this morning. That's in my hometown of Arnold, Missouri. That used to be a candy store. Now, in my mind, it was huge. I didn't realize it was some lady's basement until literally like yesterday. But that's the old candy store. And they had this arcade game, Captain America and the Avengers. So when I play this game, I literally think of going to the candy store, buying candy cigarettes, pretending to smoke them, and putting them in the ashtray at the arcade game. Because why not? You know, literally penny candy, meaning, you know, handed a lady 100 pennies. And now I think as an adult, how annoying that must have been. You know, but these are memories that we attach to these gaming experiences. And this one, by the way, typically involves the guys I was with. You know, the 3 guys I used to hang out with. You know, we ride our bikes in 4 corners and come over here, eat a bunch of Swedish fish, smoke candy cigarettes. Put, you know, you talk about like permadeath games today and roguelikes, and that thing took your quarters in about 40 seconds. You didn't beat this game. You ran out of money, got your cigarette out of the machine and walked away, right? Games have unique touch and look and sound. You already pointed out the controller one. And I'll tell you, like, when I play this, if it plays, I was having a problem with it earlier. Like that sound immediately cues up, like I'm ready to go. Like, I'm a little mad, right? And I'm trying, I know I'm doing a lot of me, but I think you can expand that to your own experience or an imagined experience of these scenarios. Games are multimodal. They attach several of the senses. Yeah, right? That's how they're designed. So nostalgia is sensory emotion. And it's not that other things can't do this too, but games do it really well. In both physical and digital ways. There's the paratexts around video games that add to the nostalgia. And then there's like the actual game itself. By the way, when I was prepping this presentation, I found this graphic. That graphic led me to an eBay page with the original marketing materials for the game. They're in my shopping cart right now on eBay. Don't do nostalgia research if you are on a budget, because you just start buying yourself back and then flying around the world to talk about it. These are some quotes. I'm kind of foreshadowing a bit of our data here in a moment. When I said earlier, some of the first research that actually connected me to an experience beyond like the data supported my hypothesis. So we did a study with a couple of hundred folks, just recalling nostalgia experiences and writing about them. Pretty vague prompt, just tell us about the experience. And that was essentially the language. It was intentionally vague. We wanted to do a thematic analysis to see what types of things would people talk about. Later, I'll get some specifics. This quote hit me. My dad died when I was 10. And playing Mario Kart with him was one of my best memories. Because I read this quote a couple of days after seeing a series of headlines about video games and addiction. Get your kid off your games, get your kid off TV, go out and play sports. And then I got this quote. And in fact, in this study, something like 30% of people would mention their parents. And it got me thinking about, like, what are the implications of telling them to turn it off? Like, you're taking away that memory that, like, maybe, okay, this isn't N of one. Wow, what a powerful memory. This person's like, yeah, I think of my dad when I think of Mario Kart. This otherwise silly kind of goofy game. That's their experiences. Another one in a study where we had people come into a lab, play Double Dragon 2, and I'll explain why here in a little bit, for about 10 minutes, and they put out some survey measures and answered questions about nostalgia, then wrote about kind of how it often as I'll have to do a survey, and then explain to me why you answered the questions the way that you did, to try to fill in a bit of the missing gaps. And again, a lot of folks mentioned family. One person mentioned, I love the phrase, my dad was a basic teen. Like, they knew what a basic teen was in the 80s. He would go to the arcade with his buddies for hours playing games. Like, this kid saw their dad as that guy. There's a neat historicizing going on there. I like to envision my dad in a 70s robe, driving his Pontiac Trans Am with long hair, like zipping around Arkansas. It turns out I've seen some of these photos. I'm like, oh my God, like, you had your 8-track and you were getting in trouble with the law, weren't you? You know, it's fun to think about those things. It's a different kind of narrative we give ourselves. But I love how they were projecting an entire, you know, caricature on the past through their 10 minutes playing an old game they never heard of. That was enough to kick off this entire cascading memory work of memories that aren't theirs. So they're wholly constructions from something else, which has, I think, implications we're not studying, especially if gamers tend to be sort of looked away from or down upon, right? So some early findings in this work, and please let me know, I'm a jabberbox. So if I start going over time and whatnot, just throw or speak or any of those things. Are some of our very first work, and I'm not sure that our causality claims are very strong. This was survey work. I'll tell you, as an editor now, I'm like, no, get out of my journal. Don't ever come back. Just get out. Just, I get furious about this. And time ordering as causality. We could talk about that if you would like. Now, our argument was we asked past-oriented and present-oriented questions. And we had a lot of couching language in this article. We wanted to know, we randomly assigned people to memory prompts that were either past memory or present memory, or it was past or most recent. So the idea was like your last time playing the game versus a game from your past. Okay. Then social or solo, playing with other people, playing alone. So 2x2 design. And we were looking at the extent to which these memories were related to nostalgia, possibly by way of self-termination theory. We were wondering if the recollection of freedom of choice, you know, skill and connectedness with others would potentially drive through nostalgia. And if these sort of recollections of the past held, would it have implications for that short-term well-being cycle, the situation? In truth, I think the one that we were interested in was this one. We didn't have particularly strong predictions for autonomy and competence. We had some reason to believe that maybe playing by yourself will give you more autonomy because you're not yoked to somebody else. But the one we really cared about was relatedness. What I liked about this study is we actually found that, of course, not surprising, the past memories led to more nostalgia. That's, we don't get a Nobel for that. We don't get anything for that, actually. We just get to say more things, right? But it was that the social memories weren't inherently nostalgic. They were only nostalgic if they fostered relatedness. And it's not like this path is so strong where it's multicollinear. There is still a lot of variance left unexplained. But generally speaking, when people recall the past and recall those memories being the types that really satisfy their needs for relatedness at the time, that also fostered nostalgia. When they remembered independently just being good had a small effect on nostalgia. That kind of makes sense. I'm not going to be nostalgic for things that sucked. Generally speaking, I wouldn't be. there might be a bit of selective engagement of the past. I mean, in high school, I think I was great at football, but I am not playing football right now. And there's probably a memory drip that if I were to go back into my sophomore year and realize I wasn't that good at football, I'm pretty short and not very coordinated. And actually, I didn't play that much for what it's worth. But in my head, that one play, the world stopped when I made that one catch. It was one catch, actually. Ever. Nostalgia did seem to be related to feelings of vitality, feelings of connectedness, and feelings of optimism. That could be a bit of a halo effect. Just nostalgia feels good, and so these other things feel good. There were inner correlations here, but of course, the one we were interested in was this connection to connectedness. We've not followed up on this. The paper says we're going to. Future research should. So if you want to, I'll send you the paper because we haven't done it yet, right? But it was a start. It was a start that gave us some inklings about the social nature of nostalgia. Because I don't know why on the research team, I was very like, oh, that's crazy. Come on, nostalgia's not social. Nostalgia's like me eating apples as a kid. That's what nostalgia is. Turns out when you read the literature, nostalgia is quite social, and the data also support the idea of nostalgia being social. That identity piece, by the way, I don't think has been well investigated. And I'll get to that here in a little bit. And the qualitative themes, we found, these are kind of, I think, kind of neat. So again, open thematic analysis, Braun and Clark method, which I really enjoy, frankly. Like it's kind of fun to like see those buggers pop up. You ever count like 1, 2, 10%, you're a theme. You know, I take a quant approach to thematic analysis. As you mentioned, 10% of my sample, 9%, nope, not a thing, never. And review or something like that, but we can talk. Reviewers are on the phone listening. But I love it when the themes emerge. I love it when the daisies pop up, right? And so for the nostalgic memories, enjoyment was a theme 40% of the time. It was only 16% of the time for recent memories. So even if people engage in positivity biases, you would think they would do it for recent memories too. And yet we were seeing enjoyment pop up a lot more. Again, not totally surprising, but indicative of a relatively positive experience, right? Challenge was mentioned 35% of the time in the nostalgic memories and only 5% of the time in the recent memories. They were recalling the mechanics of the game. They were recalling the play itself and the puzzle solving. It was probably related to enjoyment. Some of that could be the case that especially older games were much more focused on gameplay than narrative development. I think that's a relatively new thing in like the AAA space, right? This one, probably not too surprising, of course, you know, childhood was mentioned more. Although some folks did mention childhood even in their recent memories. And what was wild about that is I think what they were doing is sometimes in the recent memories, they were thinking about an old game. They would compare it. So that was kind of neat. Again, I can provide all the, I'll just send them over. I'll send you a whole bucket of manuscripts, a whole bushel. Again, there was that social element that was very common in gaming-based nostalgia. Family and friends were just mentioned a lot. Has anybody played World of Warcraft Classic or know what I'm referring to? So what was it, 3 years ago? Does that sound right? Maybe longer.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't play it. I don't take heroin either.
Yeah, right. It's always fun by the way doing this work because you get after the lecture, people are like, I got you here. Let's play. My name, by the way, is Bowman Spartan on every game platform imaginable. So if you're finding me on there, I'm probably dorking around. Right now it's Fallout 76. I was one of the 3 people playing it, and now everybody plays it. So I feel vindicated. It just took 4 years to get there. So WoW Classic comes out, and WoW Classic is the re-release of the almost original version, like 1.6 something, complete with bugs. And it was a chance to reset the experience for the company's 25th anniversary, 30th anniversary. It was a celebration of Blizzard. So they really, I think you're right. Yeah, they were just like celebrating the game and the company that they re-released it. And the line to get in was huge. People were even joking, oh yeah, just like Warcraft, you log on and grab a Mountain Dew and just, hang out and wait for 3 hours because the server's busy. Oh, there's that old glitch again. But they were trying to let people return to this curated experience, kind of like the Zelda, right? We found that personal nostalgia was highest, of course, when people had prior experience. But again, the social presence bit. People were remembering their guildmates, their friends, even though they weren't there. A lot of folks were remembering people who had passed away. And they'd be like, yeah, I logged back in. I went back to this town to kind of see what it was like for my buddies who can't be here anymore. And that social bit kept coming up in the experience. So there's this curation of our associations with each other, right? Looking deeper into WoW Classic, we found things like, I wanted to finish what I started years ago. Sense of place is an area that I have been studying lately. I won't talk about it today because you'll never get me out of here. But this idea that places become like interpersonal beings that we attach to at a socio-emotional level, it's been studied in cultural geography for a long time. And it's only just now being studied in VR environments. And so if you want to talk about that over a pint, I'd love to. I'll even buy it to forgive you for me chewing your ear off on this.
Taking notes now.
I love this area of research. It's fascinating to me. And we have some grant money. We'll talk later. But it was this idea of the familiar, of knowing a place like a person, is what Twan would say in the 70s. Social presence, a sense of community, we kind of already talked about that. Okay. So then we tried the haptic study. I was damn convinced that haptics would matter. How could they not? That's a Nintendo. It's on the t-shirt. It's in the advertising. I got a drawer of these controllers. I'm so nervous that one's going to break that every time I see one under $10, I just buy it. And they're just in the drawer in my house. There's a bunch of Nintendo controllers. It's a bit of a weird thing to own, but tell you what, when the aliens come and the only thing that's going to operate that ship is a Nintendo controller, thank me later, and we'll be fine. What I thought would happen is if I recruited young people to play, they'd be like, what's this thing? For them, this might be more familiar, the pistol grip, which I begrudgingly accept. It is more comfortable. My hands are gigantic compared to this thing, and I'm not that big of a person, right? For older players, I thought it'd be reversed. This would be the personal, and that would be the historical. So we were like, what if we randomly assign people? Come to the lab, we have them play a Nintendo Wii Classic, and we hide the console so you don't see it's a classic, and we just have the wire coming out of the box, and you have the controller in your hand, and everything Mario Brothers. Figured, nice, easy game, people are generally familiar with it. And here's the setup. So it was like, here's the old school. This controller kind of splits the difference. It still has the shape of the old handheld, but it's got some superfluous buttons. And then you have the familiar pistol grip. And again, we were looking to see how age would relate. Age is a proxy for gaming experience, as a proxy for personal nostalgia, might be influenced by playing the same exact game with these controllers. And no, it didn't matter at all because we chose Mario. This is nostalgic. In fact, even the people, sort of the mean on a 7-point scale, 6. It's a great lesson in floor effects. Wonderful lesson for my stats class the following year. I'm like, look what happened. Even watching it, the control condition, their scores were just as high. Again, the sound, the sight, things like that. But we did find some cool things. So the controller meant nothing. Playing it was not even a requirement for nostalgia, which I think is actually interesting. Just seeing it was enough. For historical as well, by the way. Personal nostalgia went up if you played before, of course. Historical nostalgia was higher if you never played, which now sounds like no kidding. We didn't know that yet. Even the idea of personal and historical nostalgia isn't quite accepted. So it was some trace empirical evidence that no, there really is this thing that when you've not done something, you can feel a certain kind of nostalgia that's not personal when you engage this experience. And like the competence measure from the survey that wasn't really causal, if you felt like you played better, you did feel better nostalgia. That kind of makes sense. That's going to be important later. Has anybody ever tried to play an old game and failed miserably at it? It's infuriating. You're like, those were really hard. I've not seen that research yet, because a lot of games today, they call it story mode. That's a nice way of saying, do you just want to win in life and not deal with this? All right, cool. Here you go. Just go about it. You didn't get that, and I would love to see how that might hinder nostalgia. You thought the experience was going to be great. It's like when you thought that pizza was going to be lovely, then I eat it next week and I'm like, oh yeah, it's fake American cheese pizza on a weird cracker. Why am I at this pub when we could have gone to any other steakhouse in this city? Sorry, Dave, that'll be $40. Right. And socializing again was mentioned by everybody. And in this study, they played the game by themselves. They were stuck in my dungeon lab in the cubicles playing video games. And 70% of them were like, oh yeah, I played games with my friends back in the day. So we're just seeing this dominance of this culture, like your music moment, this cultural moment. Oh, well, that was superfluous. I think I had some clever, how many times have I been on jet lag? I think I get 3. So that's one. That's one. So the controller didn't matter. So we thought, okay, I'm sticking to my guns. No, it's the children who are wrong. My theory is right. Haptics matter. So I convinced the entire lab group to follow me again, get back on the bus. I think it was the game. Let's use a game that is typical retro if we're using their age as an anchor, the beat 'em up genre, where the controller might actually matter. If you ever play Double Dragon, it has a super weird controller layout. B and A attack left and right. It's a remnant from the arcade days. And my hope was that would make the controller particularly salient for the gameplay for sort of a bygone genre. Whereas with Mario, not only is the game so well known, does anybody ever play Mario on a mobile phone? So it's just on mobile, you can play it on computer. There's a Microsoft Excel macro that plays Mario Brothers. And so maybe so many folks have played this game that you don't necessarily need an NES controller. So all right, I'm dusting off some OG content, Double Dragon 2, never heard of it, fantastic. I'm in the lab, learn this game. And we focused on historical nostalgia for this study, although we still did measure personal. And no, it didn't matter. The controller didn't matter. That's just Billy spin kicking and nothing's going to happen. But again, we found some cool stuff with historical nostalgia. First, people who thought they were gamers had high levels of historical nostalgia after playing this game. I think it's social identity. I think it's no. I'm a deep cut gamer. I don't just play PlayStation. I play Double Dragon 2 with a Chardonnay, right, or whatever it is, right? Like it's like who's in the music? There's deep cuts. No Dave Matthews Band. Come on, get that out of my car. I want to go deeper. I want to go deeper, right? Appreciation. So I don't know how many of you study the bifurcation of entertainment theory from hedonic enjoyment to eudaimonic appreciation. Appreciation, like a self-reflective kind of pensive meaningfulness moment attached to 10 minutes of beat 'em up. This is not content you would think, what a Picasso of video games. I feel so enlightened right now. But if you're an 18-year-old who identifies as a gamer, maybe it is. It is kind of like consuming this art form in its original version. It's like when I dust my dad's records off and pop them in. I'm like, all right, that's music. This is great. And that's what we found incidentally. This research has helped me publish more incidental research where I'm like, my predictions were stupid and don't listen to them. Here's 4 pages of why you should still listen to me. I promise I'm not lying. It's pre-registered. I'm just saying, listen. But I think we're finding something cool here, right? And this is the interaction effect. So if this is appreciation scores from 1 to 7, 1 being strongly disagree and 7 being strongly agree. Once they start crossing over the neutral point, right? All of a sudden appreciation goes up, right? That may be, I'm sorry, once they start crossing over the neutral point for appreciation, historical nostalgia is positive. They're actually getting into the history of video games. It's kids consuming this old content and having, it sounds a bit extreme to say eudaimonic moment, but within the context of gaming and gaming culture, it's this like, oh, this is the old stuff. It's like when I buy a beer from Belgium, let it sit in my cabinet for 5 years and finally open it. And I'm like, okay, let's watch some hockey now. It's that experience. This is the part that's exciting to me. You take it all the way back to the beginning of the presentation. When I talked about gamers are 33, you think it's for them, it's for their kids. It's for those sharing moments. Okay. Good on time still? No one's yelled at me yet, so.
Well, some people might need to leave at 2, but otherwise you can keep going.
Give a couple quotes, give a couple of future research directions, and then jump in at any time, right? I always make more slides than me. That's the thing I do. So, some of the memories, I was thinking about, I didn't think about my past, but I was thinking about what it would have been like to play this game. I felt like I was playing a game that would be in an arcade, which I always wanted to go to when I was a kid, but I couldn't. Playing this game made me feel like I was born in the wrong era. And yes, I am cherry picking for dramatic effect, but the thematic analysis would suggest that many people said very similar things. This paper, if the editors are listening, will be out any day now. As soon as they click that button where it says required reviews complete, just click accept, and then we're good. Just hoping maybe someone tuned in. I'm gonna get a rejection email on my watch in 5 minutes. All right, so it's the questions to be answered. How does nostalgia influence family communication? This Reddit post sent me to an emotional spiral. It's just using my dad's old ocarina save file. Ty Tom Booby. I messaged this Reddit user and asked if I could cite this post in the recent paper I drafted with Tim Bluff, formerly of LMU Munich, a longtime colleague for this nostalgia research. I haven't seen any research on this. This idea of literally sharing your character. I can't quite put my finger on the psychological mechanism there, but if anybody played games, sometimes that file is yours. If my brother ever came in and was even looking at my save file, it was war, right? And so the idea of like sharing your past with your family, there's something there that we haven't quite tapped. What is that experience like to play as mom, right? Or to play as anybody. And then think about if it were an avatar that was created by that person with that person's dialogue. I've not seen a lot of research on this. So I want to know if that's going on. Right? I've just seen a couple of posts in the Reddit where people talk about it. They think it's really neat, and we don't really investigate it very much. I think some historical nostalgia is happening here. I think we're probably seeing some, anybody studies parental mediation styles, would be active mediation styles where parents and children are co-playing to kind of explain these experiences. I do some work along with Jamie Banks on player avatar relationships. And one of the things we've been kind of really feverish on, we tend to think that gamers identify with their avatars, and that's the only kind of relationship that happens. There's a whole pageantry of player avatar relations that range the object, asocial pixels, the me, I've stepped into the shoes of the character, all the way out to the other, to where the character is a separate social being from me, where I care for the character in their world. And I'm curious how those prior player avatar relationships might affect nostalgic moments in terms of the memory work we engage in now and later. I want to know about presence and sense of place, whether it's what can we do to foster your experience in the environment today that will encourage nostalgia tomorrow? Are there certain moments we can give you? So this is West Virginia. Now this is post-apocalyptic West Virginia. I personally love West Virginia, so I lived there for 10 years. It's also current West Virginia. That's different sometimes. New River Gorge Bridge, one of the largest expansion bridges in the United States. If you know much of West Virginia, it's based in the national parks. It's the only state that's entirely in a mountain chain. Fallout 76 takes place in West Virginia. And I've noticed that there are things I see in the game that remind me of living in West Virginia. But then there are things in the game that I didn't actually experience when I was in West Virginia. But then when I go there later, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the teapot from Fallout 76. And I'm wondering if nostalgia could be connected there in some way, shape, or form. And then facilitating nostalgia today by revisiting old spaces, right? That could also be something that's highly relevant. What role does performance play? We kind of already talked about this. There's reason to believe that as people do well, they feel more nostalgia. And I bet that's a rose-colored past. Anybody play this level before? Are you getting anxious? I don't know if there's any more game after this level. Because I've never seen it. I think I used a Game Genie to like cheat, but otherwise, this is the speed bike level in Battletoads. Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, this. When a kid told you they beat this, you did not actually believe them the first. Like, no, you didn't. You're lying. I have beat it in modern time. So there was like a bit of like me beating up my 14-year-old self. I'm like, yeah, I got the skills. But I'd be curious to know about the relationship between prior and current performance. Things you were bad at that you're good at now. Things that you're good at that you're bad at now. Because when we're talking about games, inevitably performance is going to matter. It's going to matter. This person's really good because on loop. Although actually I think this video was a run where they actually beat the game in like 12 minutes and whatever. I'm not jealous or anything. Okay. Well, I think when I drop this, I probably broke it. Something's going to break it, you say.
This is not the computer.
Yeah. My area of work, as we get towards the end here of the presentation style, I've been intensely interested in the role of demand on player experience. And I'll cover this quickly, but I could talk about it more later. Something I mentioned earlier that a big part of game history was taxing the computer. We're also taxing the human. I mean, the neat thing about the interactive nature of games is it's a co-creation between the player and the human. It is I argue, the ultimate human-computer interaction. I'm not the only person who argues that. Some folks disagree, and I just yell over them. That's what scholarship kind of is sometimes. But you've got this micro millisecond co-creation, but as the computer gets more complicated, I'm often not so sure the human player can process all of that. Because we're always piloting something. So we always have the cognitive demands of the puzzle and the experience and the choices we have to make. There's our implicit emotional reactions to what's happening in that space on that circumplex model of emotion. There's the apparatus itself in our hand. And I mean, a lot of times the game's not hard, the buttons are hard. Right? Or there's the increasing progressive embodiment of the human. If you think about a VR system where it's gross motor skill and exertion actually plays a role. And then there are the social demands of the other humans, of the non-player characters, of my relationship with my player. And the point I'm making is that is a whole lot going on, and these things don't always complement each other. If you and I are driving down the coast and you're trying to show me Ireland, if we're driving, you're enjoying it. I'm driving the car. Right? It's a good example of games oftentimes like that. We're actually doing some research with No Man's Sky right now, looking at awe and appreciation. I'm not entirely convinced the VR session is going to be better at all. It should be better at all, but what if you have to, it's more cognitively loaded as a result. Maybe you actually end up getting distracted in the experience. And I'm wondering how this might play a role in nostalgia, because I think these demands, it's not that they're that interesting on their own. I think they're really important mediators of the experience between characteristics and outcomes. And I'm wondering how they might influence nostalgia. Or in the case of old stuff, we literally have gotten smarter over the years. I have had some times where a game that was really hard when I was a kid, I play it now and I'm like, I wasn't very bright then because this is actually not very difficult, you know. Who are we nostalgizing? In 2009, 85% of your game characters are white men. So you have to ask that question. So if we're going back to an era of gaming and eras of nostalgia in general, this is the baggage they carry with them. This morning before I came over here, I was a little anxious isn't the right word, but you know, keyed up. So I was watching Dale's Supermarket Sweep, and he just hits on all the contestants. It's real weird. He was like, hey, let's go grocery shopping. What's your name, Grady? Oh, that's awesome. Put a hand around you. How much are these apples? Hey. Like, what? This guy's a creep. Like, it was a little weird. It was a little weird. Like, The past was the past, but it was also the past, right? So it's fair to ask ourselves, like, if all these players just see themselves on screen, what if you weren't in that group? How do you reconcile that past? And so I think it's an important question to ask ourselves. So it's weird seeing yourself on screen. It didn't look that weird when it was only 13 inches. But stay in touch. And I'm happy to stick around to answer questions and comments, concerns. You can get me by email here. That's my Twitter handle, as long as Elon hasn't unplugged it yet. But that's also my handle everywhere. Apparently on Mastodon too, but I don't log on very much. Okay. And I'm happy to answer questions.
I think someone will have some questions, but let's just. I know I'm going to have an opportunity to chat with you a little bit more, so I might just give the floor over to some people here first and see if anyone has a question.
Yeah, please.
I want to start off the main bit of your work, the cognitive overload, how much we're working on that. One thing I'd be very interested, the t-shirt is not for bar. I actually don't drink. It is a game I playtest for.
Okay.
That is a real-time strategy game that's fan-led. The reason it's fan-led is it is a more traditional real-time strategy game based off, if you know the Total Annihilation series, the Supreme Commander series. These were games with thousands upon thousands of units. So literally has PC users testing their computer as much as possible.
Okay.
So putting the heaviest load possible, and then the player then literally in charge of thousands of units. But around the kind of mid 2000s and 2010, you saw the rise of Dota and League of Legends, where the real-time strategy genre just sort of split away and became incredibly esports.
Sure.
So like StarCraft had that little bit there, but started taking away some of the cognitive load.
Yeah.
And they started saying, well, look, if you produce a unit that's a little minion that's just going to die, why don't you just send them towards the enemy and you control the leader character that's personified as you?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of interested in your theory there of this is one genre where the cognitive load went down.
Which is odd because that was kind of the sales pitch of the genre.
Yeah, and then went up to a very personal control where in League of Legends, you're very quick time sort of spawns. And I just think looking at your literature, it's a fascinating split to see. And the real time has never recovered.
Yeah, so the short answer is I'm happy to share the model, the paper with you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can answer the specifics of the game, but I think I can answer the generics of the question. One of the things that we think about that model that potentially works really well is it might explain where the trade-off has to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I'll give a much more generic example, and then maybe it ramps up to yours. Who's played Detroit Become Human? It's a very narratively driven game. You can't lose Detroit Become Human. Because if you could, you wouldn't engage the narrative experience. It wouldn't mean the same thing to you intrapersonally because you'd be too worried about trying to like jump over the puzzle or make the right ludic decision. Whereas in Detroit Become Human, the hope is that you make a narrative, emotional, connected, social decision. And I suspect what's interesting in your case, so like, the controls are flash time, basically, right? Because they want the controller to be almost invisible, right? The cognitive puzzle isn't so much like not really solving a riddle so much as you're laboring on an emotional decision you have to make about who you're invested in and why. I think in this game, what's interesting to me, and maybe I don't have an answer, but a question we can investigate, is I wonder what they learned on their side that showed that there's the player that wants complete cognitive control, almost like in Warcraft, to where to some people, Warcraft was a series of decisions and the controls and the graphics and things were almost irrelevant. Like if you're a healer, it's just a bunch of menus and you're trying to solve it. I wonder if what was going on there is that really high RTS, it was basically a chess match to where it was all cognitive and like nothing else. And then maybe that dialing down of the cognitive was an attempt to bring up one of the other ones, perhaps. Like if you think about it from the limited capacity model for information processing, we might argue those 5 demands can't all be high. So I guess what I would want to know is, I wonder which one they boosted at the expense of cognitive demand. And I don't know immediately what it would be, but that's my quick guess. And I'm just thinking, like, my experience with RTS is that, like, it's chess with graphics, right? In some ways, the puzzles are different. And it doesn't mean to belittle the games, but that's the processing. It's you're in charge of 1,000 things at once, right? In those games you mentioned, I wonder, for example, in Dota and League of Legends, if they're making room for the social. You know, that now it's like, well, I need you to also, like, be part of the squad. That could be a potential hypothesis. We could test that, of course. Possibly leaving more room for the control schemes to matter, towards not just point and click, but there is a little bit of engagement with the controllers themselves. But that's the question I want to know, is I'm curious, if they brought down cognitive demand, which other demand did they maybe try to bring back up? So I think what's happening, if we treat enjoyment as the ultimate outcome, enjoyment's probably polythetic, meaning those 5 demands don't just universally predict it. You just need some of them and they can all predict it. And we see that with identification theories as well. I don't have to be physically similar to my avatar. It could matter, but I could be emotionally similar to my avatar, and that's our path. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm happy to share the paper with you, because I think that's the question if I were doing it through that model, what I would ask myself is, did they lower it and as a result compensate for that by boosting one of the other ones? I think that's going to be a future of game design. If this model holds up, is going to be, is there a secret sauce, a balance of those demands that is the most viable product moving forward? And it will differ based on your player base. It will differ based on your context. It will differ based on your genre. That's the fun part, right? I think that's the fun part. So
At this point, I have 2 invitations to make. One is for any burning questions, because the second one is that we might go over to the UCD Club for a little while. So if you prefer to keep your question for a chat with Nick over there, you're welcome to join us. But if you're not going to come, then you might want to make sure you ask that last question.
I have a loaded question then. Unfortunately, won't be able to join you. I suppose we'll be
you got some things.
talking for tomorrow. I loved all that, and I suppose I've one kind of burning question off the back of babies. In terms of your idea of the various types of demand that you're mentioning there, that enjoyment is polythetic. I'm wondering if you can see. I was struck by what you said about No Man's Sky and VR, and how maybe because of the demand that might mean they won't experience as much or whatever as you thought. I'm wondering, in terms of that then, if there are certain elements of demand that lend themselves better to enjoyment over appreciation, or appreciation over enjoyment, and I suppose why you're thinking that about No Man's Sky.
The very short answer to that would be, I'm pretty convinced there's going to be a direct connection between the emotional demand and appreciation. That's where you're going to foster it, and because you're hoping to form that implicit, bottom up emotional reaction to content. That's probably the best candidate. I would probably even go so far as to argue that cognitive demands could actually reduce appreciation, in the sense that if they distract you from your ability to connect and process with the narrative, there could be a potential tension there. I can imagine scenarios where the control schemes foster connections. So has anybody here played Heavy Rain for PlayStation 4? It does have a PlayStation Move. Have you played it with the Move controllers?
No.
It's so weird. So you have your little boy in the beginning, and you're out in the yard playing with him. In the PlayStation Move, you're literally like bouncing him on your knee with the controller and spinning him around. That's a connection that you're making with this boy. Spoiler. It's in my.
Oh, don't spoil that. That is.
Bad things happening. He's not with you for long, and you're like, but I was just bouncing you on my knee. So that's an example of where it might leverage in. So it's not a absolute.
Sure.
I think it's going to be contextualized to the signature of that game. And I need to be testing this. What I've done so far is taken that model. We have a scale to measure those things. We have the scale in 5 languages, and that's great. But like, we're still not doing any lab testing. we can only blame COVID for so long, and that excuse is starting to wane. So I need to get my butt back in the lab. We have a Korean, a German, a Mandarin, a Portuguese, and a Spanish version, an English version of that scale. And they're all cross-sectional. Like I really need to stop. I need to just get into the lab. But yeah, I think it's going to be, and like with nostalgia, for example, I think in that situation, that social is probably going to play a really big role, you know, in terms of people recalling those experiences, right? So I think there will be some baseline, and that will probably be emotional again. Social also plays a role in appreciation, which then connects back to nostalgia, because I suspect if nostalgia is social emotion, that's where you're going to see those paths even further firing demand. So imagine a scenario where your independent variable, your game feature is something that triggers nostalgia. It's probably going to trigger those levels of demand. In fact, think back to the Mario where some people weren't even playing it, so there was no cognitive demand there. I mean, I don't think it was. They were feeling through someone else's experience. By the way we made sure the videotape was random is we simulcasted gameplay to somebody else in the other room. It's a cool design tip, because if you use a video recording in your condition, as a reviewer, I'm going to knock it because everybody in the control condition saw the exact same gameplay. So we just simulcast people's terrible gameplay to the other screen. It was kind of fun. So yeah, that's where I think it might go. Yeah.
And if I could, sorry, just the very last point,
Yeah,
if I could
sure.
push you on, I don't know if you're planning on doing VR versus non-VR.
We are. Yes, that's actually the test. We have a PSVR 2 and the new No Man's Sky. They downloaded a PS5 patch that allows you to use the PSVR 2. My students unpack. Oh, they're super diligent when it comes to new technology and setting it up and playing it and not inviting me. They all log hours on this headset, and I'm like, cool, it's great. How's the paper coming along?
So if I could push you, are you anticipating one condition will produce more appreciation than the other? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think the hypothesizing is David Peters is the grad student leading it. The hypothesizing he is given is that the progressive embodiment inherent to VR should increase experiences of awe, because if awe is perceptual vastness, you're literally standing in the vastness of space. And if that awe is increased, then we should see an increase in appreciation. I am happy to support him, and I think he's right. Being a stubborn professor, we're also measuring demands, because I think it's dependent on stage one moderation of demands or mediation of demands.
In that tradition, you've connected like all my PhD students.
We'll have some fun pie talks over this one. You had a question, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, because obviously you mentioned that not everyone, you didn't have to play the game to feel the
Yeah.
nostalgia. Yeah, have you done very much of kind of around, you know, the whole Twitch platform and like the audience of people?
We really need to. I have been severely deficient in paying attention to where these experiences are happening. We know that retro streamers are a thing. Partly, full disclosure, the drawback of doing niche search is you get blinded. So to me, I'm like, oh, those are emulators. That's not really nostalgic. That's a stupid position to take. When you're an old gaming snob like me, I'm like, I need to see RCA cables, plug in a duct tape, plug it into a tube TV, which by the way, at my house, I can stream from my actual Nintendo. It's a very elaborate setup. But I was a little dismissive of it, and I shouldn't be, because there's a lot of retro streamers out there. I think you're onto something. I think it is probably the exemplification of that idea of actually honoring the past of video games. So whether it's like Angry Video Game Nerd, which I do enjoy, sometimes he says things I wish he wouldn't say, but otherwise I enjoy the content. I think there are other pieces of content where people are engaging, and importantly, it almost has seemed like a form of gaming capital to have those experiences. It's also driven the cost of retro games up through the roof. But that's a good sign if you are respecting the medium. We're also seeing the preservation efforts. And so a lot of people have taken to preserving. And I think we always assumed it was going to be like folks like me. It's not. It's younger players who actually, they're taking an even deeper interest. I think there's an entire sociology in there that we're not really looking at. And I think it's because partly I think media scholars are very negative about nostalgia. Sociologists are especially negative about nostalgia. I think psychologists might be able to argue there are some short-term benefits to nostalgia. We're not saying that like when people invoke the German Democratic Republic, we want to do that. But we are saying there are some things about your past that make you feel better. So it was kind of a long answer. And the answer is no. And I think there's a lot of potential there. And if you want to talk, I'd love to, because I think there's almost no answered questions beyond commentaries. I'm not seeing any data. Yeah.
Feelings are never good or bad to psychologists.
Exactly. That just needs to be the t-shirts. Like, they're just feelings.
Thanks again, Nick.
Yeah, no, thank y'all.
About this stuff, but yeah, one more.